Chapter 1. The Chosen One of Bethlehem. The air over the hills of Israel was heavy with a sense of ending. King Saul, the man who stood a head taller than any other, had been rejected. He had the stature of a king, but his heart had grown brittle with pride and disobedience. The prophet Samuel mourned for the failing monarchy, but the heavens were already moving toward a new beginning. "Go to Bethlehem," the voice of the Almighty commanded. "I have chosen one of the sons of Jesse to be king." Samuel arrived in the small, dusty village of Bethlehem under the cover of a sacrifice, his horn filled with sacred oil. He summoned Jesse and his sons, and as the family lined up, the prophet looked at the eldest, Eliab. He was tall, muscular, and bore the striking appearance of a warrior. "Surely," Samuel thought, "the Lord's anointed stands here." But the response that echoed in the prophet's spirit would redefine the nation's history. "Do not look at his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees, for man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." One by one, 7 of Jesse's sons passed before Samuel. Each was impressive, each was strong, but after each one, the prophet shook his head. The oil remained in the horn. "Are these all the sons you have?" Samuel asked, his voice tinged with confusion. Jesse hesitated. "There remains yet the youngest," he said, almost as an afterthought. "But behold, he is keeping the sheep." To the family, the youngest boy was so insignificant that he hadn't even been invited to the sacrificial feast. He was out in the wilderness, smelling of wool and wood smoke, protecting the flock from the lions and the bears. But Samuel insisted, "Send and fetch him." The boy was brought in. He was ruddy, with beautiful eyes and a handsome face, yet he carried the quiet stillness of one who spent his days in solitude and prayer. As he stepped into the room, the command came, "Arise, anoint him, for this is he." In the presence of his brothers, the holy oil was poured over the head of the shepherd boy. There were no trumpets, no crowds, and no immediate throne. There was only the silent, invisible descent of the Spirit of the Lord upon David from that day forward. As the boy returned to his sheep that evening, the world saw only a shepherd. They did not see the giant killer. They did not see the psalmist. They did not see the man who would capture the city of God. But the crown was already his in the eyes of eternity. The era of the shepherd king had begun. Chapter 2. The Giant in the Valley. The peaceful hills of Bethlehem soon faded into the background as the drums of war began to beat. The Philistines, the ancient and bitter enemies of Israel, had gathered their armies for battle. They stood on one mountain, while the men of Israel stood on another, with the Valley of Elah stretching like a jagged scar between them. For 40 days, a terrifying figure emerged from the Philistine camp. He was a giant of a man named Goliath, standing over 9 feet tall, encased in a coat of bronze mail that shimmered like a serpent's scales. His voice crashed through the valley like thunder, mocking the God of Israel and demanding a single challenger to meet him in mortal combat. Fear was a contagion in the camp of King Saul. The seasoned warriors, the men of stature, and even the king himself stayed huddled in their tents, paralyzed by the sight of the giant. Into this atmosphere of cowardice walked the shepherd boy. David had been sent by his father to bring roasted grain and bread to his older brothers. He arrived just as the giant stepped forward to shout his daily defiance. While the soldiers fled in terror, David stood his ground. His heart burned with a holy indignation. "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine," he asked, "that he should defy the armies of the living God?" When David's words reached King Saul, the boy was summoned. Saul looked at the youth and saw only a child. "You are not able to go against this Philistine," the king said. "You are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his childhood." But David spoke not of his own strength, but of the faithfulness he had learned in the wilderness. "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear," David said, "he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul tried to dress David in royal armour, but the bronze plates were heavy and foreign to the boy. "I cannot go in these," David said, "for I have not tested them." He cast off the king's protection and chose instead the tools of a shepherd. He took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the brook, and put them in his shepherd's bag. With his sling in his hand, he stepped out into the valley. When Goliath saw the boy approaching, he laughed in derision. "Am I a dog, that you come to me with sticks?" he roared. "I will give your flesh to the birds of the air." David's response echoed across the valley, a declaration of faith that would be remembered for 3,000 years. "You come to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a shield, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." As the giant moved forward to attack, David did not retreat. He ran toward the battle line. He reached into his bag, placed a stone in his sling, and swung it with the precision of a master. The stone whistled through the air and struck the giant in the only vulnerable spot, his forehead. Goliath, the champion of the Philistines, fell face down upon the earth. The silence that followed was broken by the cheers of Israel. The giant was dead, defeated not by armour or might, but by the faith of a boy who knew that the battle belongs to the Lord. The shepherd had saved a kingdom, and in that moment the name of David was etched into the heart of the nation forever. Chapter 3. The Fugitive Prince. The victory in the valley should have been the beginning of a golden age, but for David it was the start of a long and lonely exile. As the women of Israel danced and sang that Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s, a dark spirit of jealousy took root in the king's heart. Saul looked at the young hero and saw not a saviour, but a rival. The palace became a place of peril. Even as David played his harp to soothe the king's troubled mind, Saul would lash out, twice hurling a spear at the boy's head. It was only through the deep and sacrificial friendship of the king's own son, Jonathan, that David escaped with his life. Their souls were knit together in a bond stronger than blood, and as they wept and said their goodbyes in a lonely field, David stepped into the wilderness as a fugitive. For years, the future king of Israel lived like a hunted animal. He moved through the jagged limestone cliffs and the scorched deserts of the south. He took refuge in the cave of Adullam, where he was joined by a ragtag band of 400 men, the distressed, the indebted, and the discontented. This group of outcasts became the foundation of David's future army, a brotherhood forged in the fires of shared hardship. Saul's pursuit was relentless. The king took 3,000 elite troops to hunt David through the crags of the wild goats. Yet, even as he was hunted, David's character remained unblemished. The turning point came in the desert of En-Gedi. Saul, unaware of his surroundings, entered the very cave where David and his men were hiding in the shadows. David's men whispered for him to take his revenge, to strike down the man who sought his life. Instead, David crept forward and secretly cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Even this small act of defiance troubled David's conscience. He stayed the hands of his men, saying, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing unto my master, the Lord's anointed." When Saul left the cave, David stepped out into the light and called after him. He held up the piece of the robe as proof of his loyalty. "Behold, this day your eyes have seen how the Lord delivered you into my hand, but I spared you. I will not stretch forth my hand against my Lord." For a moment, Saul's heart melted. He wept and acknowledged David's righteousness, admitting that the shepherd boy would surely be king. But the peace was temporary. The hunt would continue until the mountains of Gilboa claimed the lives of both Saul and Jonathan in a final, tragic battle. Through these years of wandering, David learned that a king must first learn to be a servant, and that the greatest victory is not over an enemy, but over one's own desire for vengeance. In the silence of the caves and the heat of the desert, the fugitive prince was being prepared for the weight of a crown. Chapter 4. The Crown and the City. The news of the defeat on Mount Gilboa reached David like a physical blow. He did not celebrate the fall of his enemy. Instead, he tore his clothes and wept for Saul and his dear friend, Jonathan. The man who had been hunted for years now stood as the only hope for a shattered nation. David went up to the ancient city of Hebron, and there the men of Judah anointed him king. But it would take 7 more years of struggle before all the tribes of Israel would come together to acknowledge his rule. Finally, the elders of the nation gathered and made a covenant with him, recognizing that even when Saul was king, it was David who led the people to victory. Now established as king of all Israel, David turned his eyes toward a strategic prize, a mountain fortress held by a tribe known as the Jebusites. It was a place many thought was impenetrable, so well defended that its inhabitants mocked David from the walls. But David saw a way through the water shafts, and his men captured the stronghold. This fortress, known as Mount Zion, became the heart of the nation. David renamed it the City of David, but history would know it simply as Jerusalem. It was here that the shepherd king built his palace, not just as a seat of power, but as a center of worship. David knew that a kingdom is only as strong as its devotion to the Almighty. He resolved to bring the Ark of the Covenant, the very footstool of God's presence, into his new capital. The procession was a scene of unmatched joy. The king himself laid aside his royal robes, dressing in a simple linen garment, to dance before the Lord with all his might as the trumpet sounded and the people shouted. As the ark was placed in the tent David had prepared for it, Jerusalem was transformed. It was no longer just a political capital. It was the holy city. The borders of Israel expanded. The enemies of the nation were subdued, and for a brief, shining moment, the land enjoyed rest. From his palace of cedar, David looked out over his kingdom and felt a deep stirring of gratitude. He had moved from the sheepfolds to the heights of Zion. Yet, even in his greatness, David remained a man of deep humility. He desired to build a permanent house, a magnificent temple for the Lord. While God denied David the chance to build the temple, citing the blood on his hands from years of war, he gave David something far greater, a promise that David's house and his kingdom would be established forever. The shepherd boy was now the great king, and Jerusalem was his crown. But the peace of the palace would soon be tested by a shadow that began within David's own heart. Chapter 5. The shadow on the roof. It happened in the spring of the year, at the time when kings usually go out to battle. But David remained in Jerusalem. This small decision, to stay behind while his men were in the field, opened a door that could never be fully closed. Late one afternoon, the king rose from his couch and walked upon the roof of the palace. From that height, he saw a woman washing herself. She was beautiful to look upon. In that moment, the man who had mastered giants and armies failed to master his own eyes. The king sent and inquired after her. Her name was Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah the Hittite, one of David's own elite warriors. Despite this, David sent messengers to take her. The sin of a moment led to the crisis of a lifetime when word returned to the palace. The woman was with child. To hide his sin, David attempted to manipulate Uriah, calling him home from the front lines in hopes that he would spend the night with his wife. But Uriah was a man of honor. He refused to enjoy the comforts of home while his fellow soldiers were sleeping in the open fields. Fearing exposure, David's heart turned cold. He wrote a letter to his general and sent it by the hand of Uriah himself. The letter contained a death warrant. Set Uriah in the forefront of the hottest battle, and retreat from him, that he may be struck down and die. The plan worked. Uriah fell in battle, and after the time of mourning was over, David took Bathsheba to be his wife. To the world, it looked like a tragic wartime marriage. David continued to sit on his throne, to lead his people, and to offer sacrifices. But the scriptures record a chilling sentence. The thing that David had done displeased the Lord. For nearly a year David lived in the silence of his unconfessed guilt. But the silence was broken by the prophet Nathan. He came to the king with a story of a rich man who had many flocks, yet stole a single, beloved pet lamb from a poor neighbor to feed a traveler. David's anger burned against the rich man. As the Lord lives, the man who has done this shall surely die, David cried. Then Nathan looked the king in the eye and spoke the four most devastating words in David's life. You are the man. The mask was stripped away. Nathan revealed that God had seen everything done in the secret places. He told David that while God would forgive him, the consequences of his actions would haunt his family for generations. The sword, Nathan said, would never depart from his house. David did not offer excuses. He did not execute the prophet for his boldness. Instead, he fell to his knees and confessed, I have sinned against the Lord. In that brokenness, David wrote the words of the 51st Psalm, pleading for a clean heart and a right spirit. He was forgiven, but the shadow had fallen. The peace of Jerusalem was fractured, and the king would soon find that the greatest enemies he would ever face were born of his own blood. Chapter 6. A house divided. The prophet Nathan's warning began to manifest in the corridors of the palace. The king's great sin had fractured the moral authority of his home, and from that crack emerged a rebellion led by his own flesh and blood. David's third son, Absalom, was a man of breathtaking beauty and dangerous ambition. After years of stewing in resentment over family grievances, Absalom began a calculated campaign to steal the hearts of the people. He would stand by the city gates, listening to the complaints of the citizens and whispering, If only I were judge in the land, I would give every man justice. With the patience of a predator, Absalom waited 4 years until the timing was right. He fled to Hebron and declared himself king. The news hit Jerusalem like a thunderclap. The hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom. David, now an older man, chose not to turn Jerusalem into a slaughterhouse. To save the city, he chose exile once again. The king walked out of his capital in tears, his head covered and his feet bare, crossing the brook Kidron as his loyal servants wept beside him. The man who had once been a fugitive from Saul was now a fugitive from his own son. As David took refuge in the wilderness of Mahanaim, Absalom entered Jerusalem and sat upon his father's throne. But the rebellion was destined for a violent end. The 2 armies met in the wood of Ephraim. Before the battle began, David gave a singular, desperate command to his generals. Deal gently for my sake with the young man, even with Absalom. The battle was fierce, but the seasoned veterans of David's guard were too strong for the rebel forces. As Absalom fled on his mule, his long thick hair caught in the tangled branches of a great oak tree. He was left hanging between heaven and earth. Despite the king's command, Joab, the commander of the army, took 3 spears and struck Absalom through the heart. David sat by the city gates, waiting for news. When the messenger arrived, he did not ask if the battle was won. He asked, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" When he heard the truth, the king did not celebrate his restoration to the throne. He climbed to the chamber over the gate and cried out in an agony that echoed through the centuries, "O my son Absalom, my son, Absalom, would God I had died for thee. O Absalom, my son, my son." The victory was turned into mourning. David returned to his palace, but he was a changed man. The fire of his youth had been replaced by a quiet, sombre wisdom. He had seen the cost of his own failure and the high price of power. The house was divided, the kingdom was scarred, but in the midst of the wreckage, David's heart remained anchored to the one who had called him from the sheepfold so many years ago. Chapter 7. The Sweet Psalmist of Israel. While the history books remember David as a warrior and a king, he is perhaps best known to the world as the Sweet Psalmist of Israel. His life was a storm of public triumphs and private tragedies, but his inner life was captured in the rhythmic beauty of the Psalms. These were not just poems. They were the raw, honest conversations of a soul standing naked before its creator. David's songs cover the entire map of human emotion. In the 23rd Psalm, we hear the peaceful voice of the boy in the hills of Bethlehem, trusting in the shepherd who leads him beside still waters. It is a song of absolute safety, even in the presence of enemies and the shadow of death. But David was also a man who knew the crushing weight of despair. In his songs of lament, he cries out from the depths of the cave and the darkness of the dungeon. He asks the hard questions that every human heart has whispered. My God, why hast thou forsaken me?" He speaks of his bones waxing old and his tears being his food day and night. The beauty of David's worship was its brutal honesty. He did not hide his anger, his fear, or his confusion. He brought his whole self, the hero and the sinner, into the holy precincts. Nowhere is this more evident than in his psalms of repentance. After his fall with Bathsheba, he did not offer a shallow apology. He cried out for a clean heart and a right spirit. He acknowledged that the sacrifices God truly desires are not the blood of bulls or goats, but a broken and a contrite heart. Through his music, David transformed the tabernacle into a house of song. He appointed 4,000 Levites to praise the Lord with instruments he had personally designed. The air of Jerusalem was constantly filled with the sound of harps, lyres, and cymbals, creating a culture where the people were constantly reminded of the greatness of their God. David's legacy as a psalmist teaches us that a man after God's own heart is not a man who is perfect, but a man who is transparent. He was a king who was not afraid to weep, a warrior who was not afraid to dance, and a leader who knew that his greatest strength came from his utter dependence on the Almighty. Even today, when the world walks through the valley of the shadow, it is to the words of the shepherd king that they turn. He gave a voice to our suffering and a melody to our hope, proving that while a throne may crumble, a song of faith can echo through eternity. Chapter 8. The Eternal Covenant. The years eventually settled heavily upon the great king. The hands that had once swung a sling with deadly precision now trembled with the chill of old age. David knew that his time on the earth was drawing to a close, and his thoughts turned to the future of the nation he had built from the dust. His final act was one of preparation. Though he was not permitted to build the temple himself, David spent his remaining strength gathering the wealth of nations for the project. He amassed mountains of gold, silver, bronze, and iron, and imported the great cedars of Lebanon. He wanted to ensure that when his son took the throne, the house of God would be exceeding magnificent, of fame and of glory throughout all countries. He summoned his son, Solomon, and gave him a charge that echoed the ancient laws of Moses. "Be strong and show yourself a man," David said. "Keep the charge of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways and keep his statutes, that you may prosper in all that you do." But the legacy of David was not merely a building of stone or a stable kingdom. It was a promise. Centuries earlier, God had made a covenant with David, swearing that his throne would be established forever. David died in a good old age, full of days, riches, and honor, and was buried in the city that bore his name. To the historian, David was the architect of an empire. To the poet, he was the voice of the soul. But to the eyes of faith, David was a shadow of a much greater king to come. As the centuries passed and the earthly throne of Jerusalem eventually fell to foreign empires, the people of Israel clung to the promise of the Son of David. They looked for a Messiah who would not just rule a piece of land, but would rule the hearts of men. The New Testament begins with these very words: the book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the Son of David. The shepherd boy who was called from the fields of Bethlehem pointed the way to the great shepherd who would be born in that same village 1,000 years later. The life of David is a story of the human condition in all its complexity. It shows us that greatness and weakness can live in the same heart. It teaches us that while our sins have consequences, they do not have the final word. Most of all, it reveals that God does not call the qualified, he qualifies the called. The shepherd boy left his sheep to lead a nation, and in doing so, he became a man after God's own heart. His crown is gone, and his palace is in ruins. But the song of the shepherd king continues to lead the faithful home, reminding us that even in our brokenness, we are never beyond the reach of the shepherd's grace.